Simon Hill is a physiotherapist and nutrition scientist dedicated to making health and nutrition easy to understand. You'll see him everywhere online at the moment. I know that's where I first saw his work. And he talks about this. He was inspired by his father's heart attack, and he shifted his focus away from physiology and anatomy related to athletic performance to studying nutrition's role in disease prevention. That's quite a big jump. And I discussed this with Simon in the episode, going from sports into something like this with public health nutrition. So he completed his Master of Science in Human Nutrition at Deakin University to combat misinformation in the wellness industry. And he now leads immersive longevity experiences, helping people live healthier and happier, longer lives. So without further ado, let's have an amazing chat about nutrition. We delve right in here. The science is great. So welcome, Simon.
Rhi, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I'm so glad we got a time because I've been looking at all the amazing things you do online, and I think such an incredible place to start, and I think quite inspiring for our listeners, would be the fact that you had more of a sports background, a physical, like an athlete, and then suddenly you diverted your life by looking at things like chronic diseases and nutrition and quite groundbreaking things. So could you give us a little bit about your background for those that don't know?
Sure. I think that story arc, like many people, perhaps many of the listeners, has kind of been fueled by curiosity and my own personal lived experience. So I was huge into sports growing up. I played football and basketball in Australia, was super competitive. Thankfully, my parents drove me to all of the practices and games, which I appreciate a lot these days, and may have took for granted then. But, you know, I wanted to be involved in sport when I was finishing my sort of secondary school studies. And so I found myself doing a degree in physiotherapy and then going down the path of sports physiotherapy, where I could take my interest in football and in science and work with athletes who are trying to perform at their highest standard possible. And for me, that was a really incredible part of learning experience, I guess, early on in my career. And I was very, very fortunate to go straight into working at one of the best sports medicine practices in Melbourne called Plantbased Medicine Centre, and working with professional footballers in the Australian Football League. And so I jumped kind of right into the deep end, and I was learning so much about rehabilitation and recovery and how important this was to an athlete's performance. And at the same time, I was, getting a lot of questions from athletes about, should I supplement with collagen? Will that help my recovery? How much protein should I be eating? All these sorts of things, which as a physiotherapist, I had very little training in. I think we did one unit in nutrition over a 4-year degree. So I didn't feel very equipped to answer these questions, yet I was also very curious to know what the science said and what the answers to those questions were. And I felt like even within the four walls of the Sports Medicine Center and in the football club environment, that gap existed there as well. So I started to think about nutrition for performance and recovery. And that was kind of my on-ramp to go and deep dive nutrition. But then as I was reading more and more and thinking about my own health and having seen my dad have a heart attack at a very young age, naturally I was reading about these areas of nutrition and performance. And then I was asking, well, is this good just for performance? Or is this also good for my health generally and where I want to be in 20, 30 years? And same with the athletes. Like if I was going to give advice to someone, what's going to help them optimize for performance, but also be good for their long-term health? And, so that was kind of my on-ramp to the world of nutrition. And then I sort of opened up Pandora's box and went back to university and did a master's degree in human nutrition.
And goodness, isn't it quite some Pandora's box? I mean, it's almost like the more you know, the less you know, right?
Right. And I think, I think that's a good mindset to have, that kind of shows humility and is really important if you want to be continually improving your positions and, evolving ideas and being able to provide better recommendations. Then I think establishing that position of I have so much more to learn. And then as you're learning more, there's so many more questions I think that's a great place a position to be in if you're going to be going out and sort of advocating for public health.
I mean, absolutely with nutrition, because if we think about it and we break it down, first of all, thank you for sharing that, by the way, because I think not only is it going to resonate with so many, and heart disease actually runs in my father's side. I've lost every family member that side to heart disease. And I think a lot of people can probably relate, and it could spark, hopefully, in a lot of people, a will to change or a will to learn more, but it's difficult. And I think nutrition science is one of the newest sciences out there. And the problem we've got right now with nutritional science is that everybody, I think because food is so emotive, we're all connected to it. Everyone thinks they're an expert because they eat. So you encounter this a lot online, obviously, and you must do with your clients. Are there any huge common misconceptions that you find?
Oh, there's a lot. And I guess the question there's so many that, we could spend hours.
I know, where do you start?
going into these. But I think if we even took a step back and say, why do these exist in the first place? I think that's an interesting question as well, and something I spent a lot of time thinking about. And I think much of that boils down to the fact that news, or like something newsworthy, by definition, is information that is sort of previously not known to someone. And that's exciting. And so it can become boring to hear the same messages about nutrition over and over and over. And there's probably some type of psychological explanation for this. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I imagine that once you learn something, it actually pays not to have to pay a lot of attention to that same piece of information over and over. You want to be alert for new information, probably from a survival perspective. So naturally, we can sort of fall victim to news or new information because that's exciting. And it seems like, wow, the recommendations for nutrition are just constantly changing. And, there's a new study and out with everything we know and in with this. And so you see this flip-flopping state. And I think generally speaking, I think many people suffer from a kind of degree of anxiety because of the chopping and changing in the narrative from one social media account to the next, from one headline to the next. And so I always like to remind people that that's not actually reflective of the science. That's more psychology and news than it is science. And in reality, there is a lot that we do understand, even though there are a lot of open questions about nutrition. There are a lot of foundational things that we do understand. And the scientific consensus, overall sort of positions on various aspects of nutrition and health, that is shaped over decades and decades. It's not something that it changes massively from week to week. And because of that, it's not that exciting. It's not really newsworthy, or, very infrequently it is. And so I think that's the big misconception, is that many people probably think we don't have this worked out. If you walk into the bookstore, there's one book selling you this, there's this book selling you the exact opposite. Today's headline's telling you this, tomorrow's headline's telling you that. Fasting is great, fasting is terrible, it's going to ruin your hormones. And I think that the distinction that we have to really make here is that what we're seeing on social media and in the news is not reflective of the science. And so we don't have to just throw our hands up into the air and say, look, no one knows what they're talking about. There's all of these conflicting opinions. I'm not going to do anything. I'll get, sort of paralyzed in a state of paralysis, which many people probably end up in, and understandably so. I think we just, we have to come back to the foundational things that are well established, multiple lines of evidence that are all pointing in the same direction, and looking at, sort of themes and big picture elements of nutrition. And if we're finding ourselves kind of flip-flopping around, then we might be consuming more news than we are science.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes perfect sense, because a lot of the feedback you get online from pseudoscientific accounts or people that are trying to say, look, this is outdated, they're wrong, it's because I don't think it takes time to be sure that something that scientists have come up with is correct and applicable to people on a large scale.
And there's just, a lot of that is when you say, hey, everything that you've been taught is wrong, immediately that grabs people's attention. That is a huge hook, and a hook that I think is taking advantage of many people. And often those types of positions you're alluding to are coming from people who are not actually appreciating the context of whatever they're looking at. And, we could, again, deep dive this, but just high level, as someone who's reviewing literature on nutrition and health, I'm constantly thinking about who is the population, what age are they, what type of study was this, what dose are we talking about of a food or a nutrient, over what duration, all of these different, compared to what, if someone's exposed to that food or nutrient, what are we comparing it to? All of these things have to be considered to develop a very nuanced position, and that nuanced position is often a little less sexy.
It always is. And one thing that I think we lose a huge sight of online is the privilege that some people have to even make a choice about their lives and the access that they have to food. It's just not an option for so many people because, let's say in their generations that the art of cooking has been lost in the last generation from grandparent to parent. And then that's not going to be passed on to the younger generations if it's not in the education system. And then they live in an area perhaps where, cost of living is awful right now. It's really high. So it's a challenge, isn't it? What do you find in terms of being an authoritative voice online, or being in a position where you're challenging these quite dogmatic voices, the ones with the snappy headlines? How do you deal with that type of constant grabby nature, because they try and lure you in? Because I've seen conversations you've had with others, I kind of avoid that stuff, and I don't know how you do it. You have to respond to these people online, and it's like a call out culture.
To me, it's always about the way that they're thinking, more so than the actual position itself. So I'm looking at, how is this person coming to their position, their conclusion? Is it logically consistent? And often I can point out, clear double standards or logical inconsistencies in someone's position. For example, someone who says observational epidemiology, long-term cohort studies are flawed and shouldn't be used to develop public health recommendations, but then will point to that research when it suits them. Right. So depending on the actual nutrition question, will determine whether they like that study design or not. I'll look at the type of study that people are drawing conclusions from. So, often I'll see very strong claims, and it looks like they're supported by peer-reviewed evidence, because they'll say, like, studies show, and they'll be flashing up.
Yeah.
But
Ping.
Often that's animal research.
Yeah.
And animal research can be helpful from a kind of mechanistic point of view and hypothesis generating, but more often than not, and this has been established, more often than not, it doesn't actually translate to what you see in humans. And so it can seem like a convincing argument, on social media when, maybe you see something about soy and male hormones, for example. But unless you dig into that study, you wouldn't understand that this was a rodent study. This was a rodent that was exposed to an enormously high amount of soy isoflavones that you would never be exposed to as a human eating soy foods, and that there is human data that's actually investigated that question, which is a high quality level of evidence and more relevant to us. So really, I'm trying to show people how this person has come to their conclusion and why I disagree with it.
And from personal experience, you've obviously seen the damage that misinformation and poor diets can have on people. It's just not worth it.
Yeah, it can lead to people becoming very anxious about their food choices, because all you have to do is scroll TikTok or Instagram, and there's so much fear generated about all of these different compounds, whether it's lectins or phytates or soy, and this is by and large very unnecessary, and I think is kind of a distraction from what really matters most. Massively
so. And I've seen you do a lot of videos recently and discussing about something that I really fervently believe in, and that is the benefit of plant-based diets. And of course, when we delve into plant-based, everybody, I talk about it all the time. We're not talking about just going vegan or making a quick overnight change. We're literally just saying, let's have some more plants, and that would be great. Let's reduce animal produce a bit. But people get very angry about the suggestion that people can get enough protein from plants sometimes as well. Do you want to touch on your standpoint on plant-based diets?
Sure. I think high level, there is a very, good reason why almost all of the nutrition guidelines around the world, whether they're the dietary guidelines at a country level or cardiology guidelines or guidelines for people with type 2 diabetes, focus on these plant-based dietary patterns. And this could be a Mediterranean diet. It could be a DASH diet that some people have probably heard of, which is a kind of similar to a Mediterranean diet, but particularly good for lowering blood pressure, or has been shown to be. It could be a pescatarian diet, a kind of Nordic style diet, a vegetarian. There's a lot of different ways of cutting this, but the theme of these dietary patterns is that they tend to be high in fiber. They have really good plant diversity, so a lot of color. There's not a whole lot of ultra-processed foods in that dietary pattern, if at all. And then when it comes to protein, there is more of an emphasis on plant protein compared to typical sort of standard Western dietary patterns today. Many of those dietary patterns I just named do include animal protein. In fact, all the ones I listed do, but there is just more of an emphasis on plant protein. Whereas the standard diet today in like America, Australia, and in the UK, about 70 to 85% of someone's daily protein intake is coming from animal sources. So 15 to 30% is coming from plants. And really that should be sort of flipped on its head the other way around. And when you eat in this way, adopting a dietary pattern that sort of meets that theme of high fiber, good plant diversity, a bias to plant protein, low and ultra-processed foods, you shift a number of really important risk factors in a favorable direction. So these things that matter for your health and are going to keep you out of the hospital, hopefully will keep you out of the hospital, particularly as you're getting older, like high blood pressure, your blood glucose levels. So how good is your body at getting glucose from your blood into the cells that need it to produce energy? Your blood lipids, so cholesterol levels, inflammation levels, all of these things tend to shift into a favorable direction when you adopt this type of dietary pattern, which puts you at lower risk of having a heart attack or stroke, puts you at lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes. It puts you at lower risk of various cancers. It puts you lower risk of long-term neurological conditions, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. The list kind of goes on. And at the same time, that dietary pattern, and this is partly responsible for some of those benefits, but not all of them. This way of eating is very good from a satiety point of view, an appetite regulating point of view. So typically you see populations that eat this way have a healthier body weight and less, body fat, which is another risk factor for those chronic diseases that I listed. So I guess that's the high level kind of reason why I'm an advocate for these plant-based dietary patterns.
It was so interesting because when I was researching my most recent book, The Science of Plant-Based Nutrition, I was trying to find real negative. I was trying to find the opposite. Why should I not do it? It was actually really hard. Obviously, there's some exceptions, be it cultural, or you may have a condition where you need X, Y, Z. But generically speaking, it was an easier change. And when you look at the numbers and the maths as well, so you look at the cost of the food and the items out there, it's cheaper to actually get more of your protein, and you're increasing your fiber, you're helping your gut health by having more pulses and beans and items in your diet. So where do you think, so for people that are confused, what are the top 3 red flags you could give people to look for on social media if someone is saying, I don't know, you'll never get enough protein on a plant-based diet, or plant-based diets mean you'll be deficient in all of these nutrients? There's kind of out there things.
Okay, I think these are 2 great things for us to talk about. One, the protein, and then one, what I call nutrients of focus. Because as you rightly pointed out, it is possible to reduce or eliminate animal foods. And if you don't make the right substitutions, you could end up with a shortfall on a certain nutrient. So I think that we want people to be aware of that. And what we're wanting to do is we want to optimize for chronic disease. So you get all those benefits, those risk factors that I just said. But at the same time, we need to make sure you have nutritional adequacy.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
We can do both with a little bit of planning.
100%.
And it takes a little bit of planning when we live in an environment like we live in now, where there is so much disparity across society, and the food environment is the way it is. So we have to be intentional, unless we want to go live in a blue zone where their environment is sort of conducive to better health, and that the healthy choice is the easiest one. Then we need to be a little bit intentional. So let's start with protein. Typically, when I see people bring up the protein point, there's this assumption that animal protein is better for building muscle. And so that's seen as favorable to the youth, to those that are sort of in the gym, particularly young men. But it's also now becoming very topical on social media for healthy aging in the context of what's called sarcopenia. So it is absolutely true that as you age, there tends to be age-related muscle loss. And with that is some strength loss. And both of these things can lead to loss of muscle function, or what's known as sarcopenia, which is a risk factor for premature death and a number of different chronic diseases. That's absolutely true. But what's happening is people are unaware of what is really driving sarcopenia. And this is a very key point. The average protein intake right now in the UK, in Australia, in America, countries like this, is about 1.2 grams per kilogram. Okay. And we have a big body of evidence, and there's a beautiful graph I'm thinking of, I'll send it to you, that looks at how strength increases with protein intake in 2 different contexts. One is if you're not doing resistance training. And so in that context, if you're not doing any resistance training and you increase protein up from 1 up to like 1.5, 1.6 grams, you don't really see any difference in strength. Nothing changes, because we don't just magically eat protein and it turns into muscle tissue and we get stronger. Right? the body is adaptive. It adapts to some type of stress. And that's what resistance training is. It's a stressor. In this other context, when you look at increasing protein intake in the context of people that are resistance training, it is true that as protein goes up to about 1.6 grams per kilogram, strength increases. And then it sort of plateaus out at 1.6 grams per kilogram. But 80 to 90% of that strength is achieved at 1.2 grams per kilogram. So why are people losing muscle at the rate they're losing today, and why are we seeing the rates of sarcopenia? It is not because they're eating insufficient amounts of protein. It's because 70 to 80% of people are doing no resistance training. So there's this huge conversation on social media right now about make sure you eat your protein, and then the best protein sources are animal protein, and this is targeting the 50-year-old woman, the 60-year-old woman. And what I like to point out to them is like, hang on. The most important thing that you can do right now is start resistance training. That's the number one most important thing. And then we have to ask the question, what is the best protein source, not only for building muscle, but for protecting you from cardiometabolic disease? And this is where plant protein has an edge over most sources of animal protein, because once you get your protein intake up to what is a sort of, moderate to high-ish intake, which I think most people should strive for, between that 1.2 to 1.6, landing somewhere in there is a good idea. Once you get up to those levels, the source of your protein doesn't appear to really matter that much. Animal protein is superior to plant protein if you're eating a very low protein diet. That is true. Okay. But once you actually get your protein to that moderate to high level, it doesn't matter in terms of strength and hypertrophy. But what we do see is that as you're increasing your plant protein, you have a risk reduction for cardiometabolic conditions. And so for me, it's a win-win. You can optimize your protein intake, and have a bias for plant protein will allow you to still build muscle, stay strong as you're aging, but at the same time, reduce your risk of heart attack, various forms of cancer, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but diabetes, etc.
It's a no-brainer. When you say it like that, and I'm really hoping people are listening, just saying that the carnivore crew, the online camps out there, the obsession with protein. And I do wonder, you raised it, and I did look into it as well, the gender divides and the gender stereotypes in community as well. It's almost like, it definitely was when I was younger, ingrained that, men have to eat meat to be strong, or that this narrative that's played out, over the generations as well. But it is fascinating. It makes no sense if you're not doing any resistance training. And just for our listeners as well, Simon, could you just reiterate that people don't suddenly have to just go to the gym? There's ways, aren't there, of obviously increasing your muscle mass.
Your body doesn't know if you're at the gym lifting a weight, or if you're at home lifting your body weight, or lifting
your
your body
for
weight.
Me, I'm like, got the mini charm. Yeah.
Exactly. So resistance training comes in many different forms. Find the one that you love the most and you can do consistently. That's going to be key. Don't force yourself to go into a gym if you feel uncomfortable in the gym and it's only going to last a couple of weeks. Absolutely not. I think just to kind of close the circle on this, Rhi, a couple of other things that often come up here that I think are myths that I think are worth just quickly busting is that plants are missing essential amino acids. So in actual fact, all plants contain all of the 9 essential amino acids. They're not actually absent. They are there. They're just, some of them are in lower ratios compared to animal proteins. And that is only an issue if you would eat that isolated food protein source for all of your calories. So if you lived in a third world country and you were getting all of your calories from rice, that could become an issue. But as soon as you have any modest diversity, the amino acids in plant foods, they take care of themselves, and you get more than enough to meet the body's requirements and to build muscle and strength. That's absolutely categorically a fact and well established now. And the other thing that I think speaks to the gender aspect you were just talking about there, and a little bit more broad than just gender, I think there's this idea in our mind that if we want to build muscle, we have to eat muscle.
Yeah, it's so simplistic when you say it like that.
And it kind of, I understand, right? It sort of logically makes sense. What I want people to know is that whether it's beef or it's tofu, these foods contain protein, and the protein is just made up of amino acids. There are 20 odd amino acids. 9 are these essential ones. When you eat beef or you eat tofu, these proteins will be digested and broken down. Before they're absorbed, they're broken down into the amino acids. And it is the individual amino acids that are absorbed through in the small intestine and go into circulation. Whether it is leucine, which is an essential amino acid that's from beef, or leucine that's from tofu, once that is in your circulation, it's floating around as a leucine amino acid, your body has no idea where it came from.
No.
So I think that's just an important thing for people to kind of be aware of, that really all we need to make sure is that we get enough of these amino acids absorbed and into circulation so that it has the building blocks to build the muscle, and therefore we get the strength improvements that we're after. And going back to what I spoke to earlier, it is being established that once you're at that moderate to high intake of plant protein, forget all these questions about bioavailability and absorption and all of these sorts of things. We have hard outcome research where you literally put people on a diet where they only eat plant protein. That's it. No animal protein. And as long as it's at that moderate to high level, and these are in studies where they get both groups doing resistance training over 8 to 12 weeks, there's no differences in the muscle they build or the strength.
Yeah, it's just such a, I'm kind of bored of the protein messaging, to be honest with you. I'm just like, people are not deficient, generically speaking, in protein anyway. And there's just a huge market for it, right? I think everyone wants to sell a protein powder or a collagen powder. Let's just touch on another, have you got another myth, did you say, with plant-based diets with nutrient isolation in terms of like a vitamin or a mineral that you could be deficient in? And then I want to touch on collagen very quickly with you. Just, I feel like we have to.
There's certainly some nutrients of focus when you are adopting a more plant-based dietary pattern. Certain nutrients like vitamin B12, particularly if someone was adopting a plant-exclusive diet, needs to be something that they are supplementing with. Iodine, if someone's not regularly consuming seafood and dairy, can become an issue as well. Calcium, I think, is one to plan for. And so you were saying earlier that it's difficult to find real limitations of plant-based dietary patterns. But I would say if there is one sort of population where the research suggests that there can be some negative health outcomes, it's postmenopausal women who adopt vegetarian, vegan style diets without fully sort of planning. And what we see, and it's very difficult to just decipher and determine what's causing this, but you can see a higher risk for fractures. And this could be influenced by a number of things because building strong bones
estrogen reducing anyway alone. Yeah.
Right. Building strong bones is it's a team game. It's not just calcium. It's going to be the resistance training we spoke about, protein, but also body weight. So the lighter you are, and usually in these studies, vegetarians and vegans are lighter, there's less weight going through their skeleton. But calcium, I think if you're eliminating dairy foods in particular, then you should be planning for what are you eating instead. And so at least, my recommendation here is if you're finding a plant-based alternative, whether it's milk or yogurt, you're looking for ones that actually have a good amount of calcium in them, usually sort of 200 to 300 milligrams of calcium in a serve. And if you're just removing dairy and you're not doing that, you may need to supplement with calcium in some form, particularly this postmenopausal kind of women cohort. I would just flag that. I don't think that's a difficult thing to plan for, but it's worth knowing.
I think it's really important to know, actually, because also the confusing thing for women, especially online, is there's a lot of talk for a good reason about menopause now, like tons out there, which is fantastic. But at the same time, there's so much scaremongering with fortified products. So items that have got added nutrients, because people are now talking about ultra-processed foods and they're like, oh, no, I'm not going to have the fortified soy milk. I'm going to have the organic one with no fortification. And we've lost the sight of why these options are there in the first place. And our needs do go up. Requirements change across the course of a woman's lifespan. If you're pregnant, you're postpartum, you're breastfeeding, you're then menopausal. It's so key, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. And that also speaks to another point, that not all quote unquote ultra processed foods are the same. So I think it's worth kind of just understanding that, and I didn't make it clear earlier, when I say these dietary patterns are low in ultra-processed foods, I really should be saying, I should correct myself here, I really am speaking to energy-dense, hyperpalatable foods. And so this is not your plant-based milk that has some added nutrients and maybe classified as ultra-processed. I'm talking about the foods that are really irresistible and difficult to put down, and there's so many calories per bite. They've been engineered to be very delicious. Seductive. Yeah, they are delicious, but they are foods that are, they're low in fiber, low in water, low in protein. They're very energy dense, and so those are the foods. When I say, we want to be limiting, eating less of, that I'm talking about, not the plant-based milks or plant-based yogurt.
And I think that leads us nicely on to a quick touch on calories, if you don't mind, because it's very, very different. I just don't see how we can simplify food into just a number. It's always been such a contentious subject amongst scientists. Obviously, we can't deny the energy out equation. Like, it just makes sense, fundamentally speaking. But when you are looking at those ultra-processed foods, like you said, that are so broad in spectrum, from your fortified plant milk all the way up to your fast food burger, your quarter pounder, you can't really compare the two in terms of the amount of energy you get. So do you want to delve into your thought process on calories? It's such a big question. It's so hard to simplify it into such a short answer.
Yeah, I think inevitably what happens here is people assume that if you talk about calories, then you don't think diet quality is important. And also, if you talk about diet quality, then calories aren't important. I would say both are important, but I like to first and foremost think about diet quality. And that comes back to that theme. So if I wanted to make this kind of even clearer, more practical, I'm thinking about maximizing fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, these sort of high fiber plant foods in the diet. And then if someone was eating animal foods, which they certainly can within a healthy dietary pattern, at least my read on the evidence is that foods like fatty fish, eggs, and fermented forms of dairy like yogurt and cheese are probably at the top of that list. And all of a sudden you have a Mediterranean dietary pattern in that kind of scenario. I think when you make your calories, the bulk of your calories are coming from those food groups that I've just listed out. Some people might not eat all of those food groups. Then naturally what happens is you feel more satisfied on fewer calories. Right? So these things affect one another. So diet quality affects the amount of calories that people consume, and therefore where their kind of body fat levels are at. So number one, I would focus on diet quality and try and eat consistently like how I just described. It doesn't have to be perfect. Where we're talking about consistency over decades is be imperfect, but over a long time, much better approach. And then I would say after diet quality, which is really what foods am I selecting at the grocery store? What am I filling my cart up with? After that, if their goal is to lose weight, then there are these other kind of tools that people can use, and you could lean on one, or you could pair them, that can further or help encourage that calorie deficit if you're not already there, which is required to kind of lose body fat. And by calorie deficit, I just simply mean you're bringing less energy into your body than your body is using. And that difference, that amount of energy that you're not bringing in that the body needs, it takes that from energy stores, aka fat. And so you sort of eat into your fat stores. That's how we lose weight. If you're at that point where diet quality is covered, then, is counting calories something I think everyone should do? Probably not. Certainly there are some people that shouldn't calorie count from a psychological point of view.
Yeah.
It would be contraindicated
Yeah.
and unnecessary. But there are other people who, maybe for 2 or 4 weeks, it's an exercise that's very informative, and they understand what's in their food a little more, and then from there they can go away and have a better idea as to how much food to put on their plate. And so calorie counting is kind of one of those tools, but in this same conversation, you'll hear people talk about intermittent fasting, or even plant-based dietary patterns. Like, all of these are just different ways of achieving a calorie deficit. And they could be combined. You could be listening, and it might be that you adopt a plant-based dietary pattern and you decide, instead of eating over 16 hours a day, you eat over 12. So you still have your 3 main meals, but you're not eating, as soon as you roll out of bed and all the way up to going to bed. And that might be enough for many people to naturally reduce their calories and get to whatever their goal is. So, that's kind of my overall position.
It was good. It was really well explained. And the only point I was going to interject with is something you wrote about in your book, and it just depends on the society that you're in, and it really depends on the environment, because I feel like calorie counting, if we use that as an example, has just set people up for disappointment purely because it's just not accessible to them. And the education on what you just described with the food quality and the choices and how energy dense they are just isn't there. Could you touch on that a little bit? Because I love that you put all of that in.
You can be setting yourself up for failure if you're not focusing on diet quality and you're just trying to stay underneath a certain calorie budget. And what I mean by that is that ultimately, what we're trying to do, if I'm working with someone that wants to lose weight, I want them to eat in a way where it feels as easiest as possible. Because when you're losing weight and you're in a calorie deficit, it's always going to feel a little uncomfortable. You're a little bit hungry, but I want people to feel as kind of least hungry as possible. Let's make it as easy for you as possible. And when you're just counting calories and perhaps including if it's like kind of if it fits your macros approach, which was popular for a long time.
No.
Then you might be eating foods that are not, really that sating. You're not feeling that full. And so you have to kind of grit your teeth to get through that, which I don't think is very sustainable and usually leads to kind of a yo-yo style dieting and flip-flopping between weight loss and then a lot of rapid weight gain. So I think that calories count, but you don't have to count your calories. And I think that's kind of what I said in the book. And many of the healthiest populations in the world, they are healthy body weights. They're not counting their calories. What the advantage that they have over us is that they live in a different food environment. So we have to, as I said earlier, we have to be a little more intentional, knowing that we're living in an environment that makes it hard for us to naturally kind of stay healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. We've kind of lost touch with the basic human needs versus, well, it's head hunger, isn't it? It's just which emotional crux are we leaning towards? I think food in our society, or a society of plenty, has become a way of coping. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I know that these types of conversations can be so triggering for our listeners, and we find it in the clinic a lot. But on that note, because I'm aware that there's so much to cover, and I want to take some questions from our listeners, if that's okay, Simon, as well, because I was thinking when you were talking, you've touched on phytates, so let's quickly go there very quickly. And then Lily has asked about the sustainability aspect. So could you touch on why there's such a noise at the moment online about phytates? And then we'll go on to sustainability.
So most of this stems from the fact that phytates, which is kind of like the storage form of phosphorus in a plant, it's has a strong affinity for minerals. So phytates can bind minerals like iron or zinc, and that is true. And so there's this idea out there, it's a fairly significant leap, that, okay, well, if a bean or a grain contains phytates, then that food is going to result in reduced absorption of these minerals like iron and zinc. And I think some of the influencers out there have used the language, phytates will rob you of minerals. And Dave Asprey and Paul Saladino, I've done videos on both of these guys talking about this. Dave Asprey, at least, has made it out as if the phytates somehow get absorbed and then rob your bodies of minerals. That's not what happens. If anything, it's just during digestion, phytates can bind some of the minerals and lower the absorption of minerals from that meal. They're not, let's just clarify it, they're not getting into the circulation and then somehow bringing minerals out of the body. That's the first thing that I think is important to understand. The second is that, again, these guys are usually looking at animal studies or cell cultures. And this is really important because often in these studies, they're looking at isolated phytates and how they affect minerals. But when we eat a meal that contains phytate-containing foods, firstly, what happens is when you cook grains and you cook legumes, the phytate concentration is dramatically lowered. The second is that the absorption of the iron and zinc, etc., minerals in that meal is not just dictated by phytate content. So we eat mixed meals. There are various things like phytates or even tannins, parts of our meals that can lower mineral absorption. But then there are also compounds like vitamin C or garlic and onion, which we know increase mineral absorption. So that the net mineral absorption is very much based on the meal that you're eating. So these isolated studies are not that informative. And we have studies showing, firstly, it's absolutely possible to have healthy iron status on a plant-based diet. You can get more than enough if you're eating, a wide range of foods. And secondly, there are really interesting studies looking at people who have suboptimal mineral status and feeding them meals that contain phytates. And the interesting thing is that if you were to go into a suboptimal mineral status, your body actually increases mineral absorption from meals that contain phytates over time. So on repeated meal exposure, the amount of minerals absorbed actually increases. And so if you look at a single meal study, you might not pick that up. But if you look at a study where they're doing it over weeks, you begin to see that. So I think there's a lot of fear-mongering over these cell or animal-based studies. And I also like to point out to people that, these guys love mechanisms and they want to scare you with these mechanistic studies, as opposed to all the health outcome data that we have on phytate-containing foods that shows legumes and whole grains are associated with less disease consistently. But one mechanism that they don't seem to be talking about, which is odd given how much they love mechanisms, is that there is a ton of research happening right now, and everyone can look this up, looking at phytic acid as an anti-tumor, anti-carcinogenic compound.
Wow.
So it may be that phytic acid or phytates actually have some tremendously powerful health benefits at a mechanistic level. All of that is speculation, just as what they're saying is speculation. What we should be focusing on is when you eat the foods that contain phytates, what happens to your health? These people typically do better.
Yeah, that's wild. It's absolutely wild, the focus on the mechanism and the disparity between the fact that you get all the fiber and the nutrients from the food. So I find the whole thing online crazy. And then the man that you mentioned, didn't he invent bulletproof coffee or something? Was that him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the listeners are smart enough to understand that the way a food like a legume affects your health is not going to boil down to one single constituent, phytic acid or phytates, and how that affects mineral absorption. Think about all of the myriad of mechanisms or pathways that legumes affect your health, the fiber content, the effect on blood cholesterol, the effect on blood glucose control. And so the health outcomes are essentially the summation of all of the ways that food or all of the mechanisms. And it would be impossible for us to actually understand all of the mechanisms, which is why it pays to zoom out and say, okay, let's just look at the net effect. When you eat more of that food group, what's happening to your health?
Exactly. And also the plant-based diet. So the one question I'm going to take from our listeners, guys, I think everybody listening, just purely for time, I'll have to do an Insta Live with Simon or something, because we're just never going to get through this huge list of questions that I have on my phone. And I do think we've touched on a lot of it throughout the episode. So let's just touch on the planet for a second. Eating this way is great for the planet, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll try and summarize this one pretty quickly. I think the biggest advantage of eating more plant-based is the amount of land that it frees up. And I'll explain why this is important. But right now, we've essentially turned Earth into a farm. 50% of the habitable land is used for agriculture. All right. Now, of that 50% of Earth that we use for farming, 75% is used to produce animal-based calories. Okay? But that 75% of land for animal agriculture is only giving us about 18% of our total calories. So it's a very inefficient process. In other words, we use 25% of the land we use for plant foods that humans consume, and that provides us with more than 80% of our global calories. And there's been numerous studies running the maths looking at what happens as we eat more plant-based. Eat Lancet came out with the Planetary Health Diet a few years ago. Joseph Poore and his group has done a lot of research on this. And at the very extreme, and I'm not saying that the whole world needs to eat vegan, but sometimes it can pay to kind of just consider this theoretically. If the whole world was to switch to a vegan diet today, we would go from using 4 billion hectares of land right now for farming to 1 billion. So we would reduce it by 3 billion hectares, which is the size of the African continent. Now, why is that important? Well, two main reasons. One is that frees up an awful lot of land that we can rewild, restore to natural ecosystems. Right? We're very much dominating Earth and thinking we have to extract calories out of all this land. We don't have to, and that's a complicated conversation because incentives would need to change, because understandably farmers own land, and if you say to them, rewild, they say, I need to make a living. Understand, put a pin in that. They should be paid to rewild. That's a whole nother conversation by the governments. But when you if we're able to restore that much land to these natural ecosystems, it increases biodiversity, which we're losing at a rapid pace. And biodiversity is crucial to climate resilience. And secondly, these natural ecosystems are very good at sequestering carbon, which means taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it either in a plant or in the soil. And what that does is it helps to cool the planet. So it offsets some of the warming that we're currently experiencing, which is already having a lot of effects on human populations, particularly the less privileged populations. So a lot of the damage we're doing through food consumption is actually being imparted on the world from the privileged nations, but is affecting the less privileged nations first. So that's unfair. So if you just want to think about looking out for humans, and being fair to kind of everyone in the world, and so that this is a place that everyone can enjoy and future generations can enjoy, then eating a more plant-based dietary pattern, being more environmentally friendly is going to kind of, it's a nice contribution at an individual level.
It is. And we've got less than 4% wildlife now, haven't we, in terms of the amount, if you're looking at the ratio of farmed animals, agriculture versus wild animals, that is disgustingly shocking. I find those conversations quite upsetting and I really find it hard. So thank you for summarising and giving us a few hard-hitting statistics, because the less animal produce we can consume, guys, I'm not saying you have to give it up, but just the less, if that's your jam, and then more plants, we could do something powerful. So fact or fiction round, Simon, are you ready? You have to answer fact or fiction to the following, and you can expand if you want on one or two. Okay, number one. You cannot reach protein targets or consume all 9 essential amino acids with a strictly plant-based diet.
That is fiction.
And we explained that earlier. A ketogenic diet is not a magic solution to health concerns or weight loss.
That is a fact. It can help with weight loss, particularly for certain individuals, and it does so by creating that calorie deficit, just like any other type of diet that results in weight loss.
Yeah, exactly. Implementing a plant-based diet means completely cutting out any animal products.
That's false, and I think we covered that. So plant-based means that you're basing your diet around kind of abundance of fruits, vegetables, nut seeds, whole grains, legumes, herbs, and spices, but there's certainly room for animal foods within that dietary pattern. They just emphasize less than standard Western diets.
Yeah. Collagen is anti-aging.
Ooh. I think it's heavily debated. I think most of the research on collagen and aging has been done by the industry. I will say there is some interesting results with regards to skin elasticity and skin hydration. I'm not ruling out that it's effective. I'm kind of on the fence. I'd like to see more research that's not conducted by industry.
Very well answered. Our daily habits affect our well-being, our health, and longevity.
Yes. What we do consistently, as I said earlier, doesn't have to be perfect. Over decades is really what's going to shift the needle and reduce our risk of these non-communicable chronic diseases.
Absolutely. Sugar of any form should be avoided at all costs, as this causes the development of NCDs.
Fiction. There's a bunch of sugars can be found in fruits, which we know are very health promoting. So I think the kind of sugar package or the food that you're getting your sugar in really is what matters. We shouldn't demonize sugar across the board because sugar, I often say, and this is a little more related to carbohydrates than just sugar, but you can find carbohydrates in everything from a black bean to a jelly bean. And so we can't lump all these foods into the same basket.
From the black bean to the jelly bean, exactly. Calories on the labels equals calories absorbed always.
I would say fiction.
Agree. Nutrition is more important than exercise when it comes to our health.
Oh,
I knew this would be hard. I was wondering what you'd say.
this one's tough. I think it depends on someone's personality. For me personally, when I eat well, I feel really good, and then I'm more kind of motivated to go and exercise. So I have a bias towards nutrition, but I will say I think exercise is incredibly important.
Exactly. If you are healthy and taking a variety of supplements, you're probably taking too many.
I'd say that's fact. I think most people are probably taking more supplements than they need if they're eating a healthy dietary pattern.
Yeah, completely agree. Fiber is the most important nutrient deficiency of our generation.
Yeah, I'd say today in Western populations where we have achieved nutritional adequacy across the board with regards to micronutrients, now certainly probably fiber is top of the list in terms of if people were to focus on one thing and it was to increase fiber, that's probably the single dietary switch that would make the biggest difference.
Brilliant. And then the last question, we should all be consuming fermented foods.
Yes, I think we probably should. I think you can still be healthy without them, but I think there's good evidence that fermented foods have beneficial effects on the microbiome. We're learning more and more about the microbiome. It's certainly not fully understood, but there's at least some evidence that suggests fermented foods can shift the kind of constitution of the microbiome. This can affect the intestinal permeability, which can affect sort of how many of these like inflammatory compounds called lipopolysaccharides enter circulation. And so you see with fermented food consumption improvements in intestinal permeability or a reduction in intestinal permeability, and with that lowering in inflammatory biomarkers. So I would say adding fermented foods to our diet is probably a good thing, yes.
I find that absolutely fascinating. So hard. I always wonder when researchers look at that or they study something like that, how they isolate it or how they can see. But I guess that's the beauty of science. It's just this evolving, constant process. Simon, thank you. That nearly wraps up the episode. And it's funny because I'd actually said at the start of the episode, everybody, that, we'll only be, less than an hour, about 50 minutes on this. But I feel like we've only scraped the surface, and that's what happens when you actually get people passionate about nutrition, wanting to get to the depths of the conversation at hand. We always finish with a food for thought, a take-home message. And I'll just start by saying there's so much nuance to every subject you could possibly discuss when it comes to nutritional science, and you are unique. So to anybody listening, take what you want from it, do what you can, try your hardest, and that's all you can really do. You are going to be focus on yourself, I think would be my take home. But what would be your food for thought today, Simon?
I might go with something sort of aimed towards targeting some of this misinformation that we were talking about earlier. I think right now, anecdotes are getting a lot of hype on social media. And so I would just remind people that anecdotes are interesting, and your lived N=1 experience is very, very important, particularly for you. But when you're on social media, just remember that while these anecdotes that you're seeing that often seem contradictory to one another are interesting, they are also very unreliable. And I'm not saying that the person who is sharing the anecdote online, their experience, they adopted some type of behavior, had some type of result. I'm not saying that they're lying. They actually could be true. But equally, they could be exaggerations. They could be lies. We don't really know. But the most important thing to keep in mind here is that versus clinical studies and even observational studies, we don't know for every person that has the experience that they're reporting. We actually don't know how many people had a different experience that adopted the same behavior or intervention. And so in the absence of all of that data, we have this selection sort of bias where all you're hearing about is the success stories often with something. And the algorithms kind of perpetuate that. They make it even more difficult to see that selection bias because you end up in these echo chambers. And because on these social media, when you're being exposed to these anecdotes, you don't see the full picture, it makes it very difficult to determine the effectiveness and even the safety of some type of intervention. So that would be my kind of closing food for thought, is just tread carefully when it comes to anecdotes, particularly if all of a sudden, someone is suggesting that everything else that we've known for decades is wrong.
I know. And we will all keep fighting for more regulation in this area. I think there's a group of us all online that are trying our hardest to do something. Simon, where can all of our listeners go to find out more about you, about obviously books, podcast, all of it?
So my website is theproof.com. And from there, you can kind of navigate to everything. You can find me on YouTube, which is The Proof with Simon Hill, all podcast apps, The Proof, and then on Instagram at Simon Hill.
Perfect. Simon, thank you for coming on Food for Thought.
Thanks, Rhi. It's been a pleasure.